Right now, you're sitting somewhere comfortable, maybe in a bed with sheets that were woven in a factory, maybe on a couch in a house with walls and a roof. You probably ate today food that came from a farm. You might be in a city or a town or at least somewhere with other people nearby. Buildings, roads, all the things we call civilization. Now here's what's strange. If you go back far enough in time, say 15,000 years, humans didn't have any of this. They were Ice Age hunters following mammoth herds across frozen grasslands. They lived in small bands, never staying anywhere for long, carrying everything they owned on their backs. And if you go forward to about 5,000 years ago, humans were building the first cities. Writing was being invented. Kingdoms were forming. The pyramids were about to rise. But between those 2 points, between the Ice Age hunters and the pyramid builders, there's this massive gap. 7,000 years. That's longer than all of recorded history. And most people have absolutely no idea what happened during that time. History textbooks skip right over it. Popular documentaries jump from cavemen to ancient Egypt like nothing happened in between. But something did happen, something slow and profound and absolutely fundamental to everything that came after. Your ancestors stopped moving. They figured out how to stay in one place, and in doing so they invented almost everything that makes your life today possible. The food you eat, the house you live in, the concept of property and neighbours and villages, all of it comes from this forgotten age. If you're here to fall asleep while learning about the most overlooked chapter in human history, you're in exactly the right place. Maybe hit subscribe if you want more journeys through the quiet moments that changed everything. And drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love seeing London at midnight, Mumbai at dawn, Los Angeles at sunset, all of us exploring this forgotten time together. So what happened during those 7,000 years? Why did humans decide to stop wandering and start staying? And why did that choice transform our species more than almost anything that came before or since? Let's go back. Way back. To the moment when the Ice Age ended and the world your ancestors knew began to disappear. Imagine you're standing on a hillside in what will one day be called France. But it's 12,000 years ago, and France doesn't exist yet. Nations don't exist. Cities don't exist. Agriculture doesn't exist. The year is 10,000 BCE, give or take a few centuries, and the world is changing. For your entire life, for your parents' lives, for hundreds of generations before that, the world has been cold. Not just winter cold, Ice Age cold. Massive sheets of ice, miles thick, covering everything north of where you stand. Glaciers that stretch from horizon to horizon, grinding mountains into dust, carving valleys with the slow inevitability of frozen time. But something's shifting. You can feel it in the air, see it in the landscape, notice it in the animals' behaviour. The world is warming. This isn't happening quickly, not in a single lifetime or even several lifetimes, but over decades, over centuries, the change is undeniable. The ice sheets are retreating, meltwater is carving new rivers, coastlines are drowning under rising seas, and the animals, the massive creatures your people have hunted for thousands of generations, they're struggling. Here's what you need to understand about the end of the Ice Age. For most of human history, we talk about it like it was this wonderful thing. The ice melted, the world warmed up, and humans could finally thrive. But that's not how it felt to the people living through it. To them, it was a catastrophe. Picture what's happening across the northern hemisphere. Those enormous ice sheets covering Europe and North America, they're collapsing. And when I say collapsing, I mean releasing floods that would dwarf any disaster in recorded history. Lakes the size of countries, held back by ice dams, suddenly breaking free and pouring across the landscape. Water levels rising not in inches but in feet, in yards, in hundreds of feet over the course of a few thousand years. Sea levels at the peak of the Ice Age were 400 feet lower than they are today, 400 feet. Coastlines extended miles beyond where they are now. Entire subcontinents existed that are underwater today. There was no English Channel. Britain and Europe were connected by a vast plain called Doggerland, home to rivers and forests and the humans and animals that lived there. There was no Persian Gulf. It was a river valley, lush and fertile where people had lived for thousands of years. And then the water came, not all at once, not in some biblical flood, but steadily, relentlessly, over centuries, a foot per decade, a few feet per generation. Enough that your grandchildren would see the hunting grounds of your youth vanished beneath the waves. The people living on these doomed coastlines had no idea what was happening. They didn't know about ice ages or climate change or sea level rise. They just knew that every few years the beach was a little farther inland. The islands were a little smaller. The caves their ancestors had painted were now filling with salt water. Some groups probably tried to stay. They moved their camps back and back and back again, following the retreating shoreline. But eventually there was no more back to move to. The land was gone. Doggerland, that rich hunting ground between Britain and Europe, was swallowed entirely by around 6500 BCE. Thousands of square miles of territory, home to who knows how many people just gone, sunk beneath what's now called the North Sea. But the rising seas weren't the only problem. The warming climate was transforming the entire landscape. Those vast grasslands that had stretched across Europe and Asia during the Ice Age, the steppes and tundra where massive herds of mammoth and bison and reindeer had grazed, they were changing. Forests were spreading. Trees that had been confined to southern refuges during the coldest periods were now marching north, year by year, generation by generation. And here's where it gets tricky for the humans trying to survive through all this. Your ancestors, for tens of thousands of years, had been perfecting a very specific way of life. They were big game hunters. They specialized in taking down massive animals, mammoth weighing 6 tons or more, woolly rhinos, giant bison. These were dangerous, difficult hunts that required incredible skill, coordination, and specialized tools. But these animals needed the grasslands. They needed open spaces where they could graze on grasses and low shrubs. As forests spread, their habitat shrank, and as their habitat shrank, their populations crashed. The mammoths were dying, not all at once, not everywhere, but slowly, steadily, populations that had thrived for millions of years were dwindling. In some regions, they vanished entirely by 10,000 BCE. In others, they lingered for another few thousand years, increasingly rare, increasingly desperate. And it wasn't just mammoths. The entire Ice Age megafauna, the massive animals that had defined the hunting cultures of the late Paleolithic, were in trouble. Giant ground sloths in the Americas, some as large as elephants, gone by around 10,000 BCE. Saber-toothed cats, gone. Dire wolves, gone. Glyptodons, those armoured animals the size of cars, gone. Across the world, something like 70% of large mammal species weighing over 100 pounds went extinct within a few thousand years. Scientists still argue about exactly why this happened. Was it climate change? Was it human hunting? Was it some combination of both, where climate stressed the animals and human predation pushed them over the edge? The debate continues, but for the humans living through it, the cause didn't matter. What mattered was that the world they knew, the hunting grounds their ancestors had mastered, was disappearing. Now, you might think this warming world would have been easier for humans. Warmer is better, right? No more brutal Ice Age winters, longer growing seasons, more plant foods available. But that's not how specialization works. Your ancestors weren't generalists who could easily adapt to any environment. They were highly skilled specialists. They knew how to track mammoth across snowy plains, how to coordinate group hunts to bring down massive prey, how to butcher and preserve tons of meat, how to use every part of these enormous animals for food, clothing, shelter, and tools. They'd spent thousands of years perfecting these skills, teaching them to children, passing down knowledge about animal behavior, seasonal migrations, the best hunting grounds. This was their cultural inheritance, their survival strategy, the accumulated wisdom of hundreds of generations. And now it was becoming obsolete. The forests spreading across Europe and Asia weren't the bountiful paradise they might seem. Yes, there were deer. Yes, there were plant foods. But deer are fast and wary, much harder to hunt than slow-moving mammoths. Forest plants are scattered and seasonal, not the predictable resources of grassland herds. And forests are dense, dark, difficult to navigate, totally different from the open landscapes where your ancestors had thrived. This was a crisis, not a sudden disaster where everyone dies at once, but a slow, grinding pressure over centuries. Food getting harder to find, populations declining, groups fragmenting as they searched for territories that still had the old resources. Some populations probably did collapse. Groups that couldn't adapt, that clung too tightly to the old ways, they vanished. Leaving no descendants, no stories, nothing but a few stone tools for archaeologists to find 10,000 years later. but others adapted. Your ancestors, the ones who survived, they started figuring things out. They developed new tools for hunting smaller, faster game, bows and arrows becoming more important than heavy spears. They learned which plants were edible, which were poisonous, which could be processed to remove toxins. They started fishing more intensively, gathering shellfish from coasts and rivers, trapping birds, diversifying their diet in ways their Ice Age ancestors never had to. They were becoming more flexible, less specialized. And this flexibility, this ability to shift strategies when the world changed, that would turn out to be crucial. Because the world wasn't done changing. In fact, it was about to demand something even more radical from the humans trying to survive in it. Around 10,800 BCE, something strange happened. The warming trend that had been melting the ice sheets for thousands of years suddenly stopped. Temperatures plummeted again. In some regions, they dropped as much as 15 degrees Celsius within just a few decades. Scientists call this the Younger Dryas, after an Arctic flower that suddenly reappears in the pollen record during this period. It's one of the most dramatic and mysterious climate events in recent Earth history. The world was warming, then suddenly it wasn't. It was like the Ice Age tried to come back one last time. There are theories about what caused it. Maybe massive amounts of glacial meltwater poured into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents that carry heat northward. Maybe there was a comet impact or airburst that threw debris into the atmosphere. The evidence is still debated. But what's not debated is that it happened, and it was severe. For about 1,300 years, from roughly 10,800 to 9,600 BCE, large parts of the world were locked in this mini-ice age. Glaciers that had been retreating surged forward again. Forests died back, and the humans who'd been struggling to adapt to the warming world now had to deal with it getting cold again. This should have been humanity's breaking point. Populations were already stressed from the megafauna extinctions and landscape changes. Now the climate was whipsawing back toward Ice Age conditions. Groups that had moved north into newly warming territories suddenly found themselves in marginal environments again. But here's what's remarkable. Humans didn't collapse. They didn't go extinct. They didn't even decline that much as far as we can tell from the archaeological record. Instead, they innovated. They found new strategies. They got creative in ways their ancestors never had to. Because by this point in human history, your ancestors had something that earlier humans didn't have. They had 50,000 years of accumulated knowledge since the cognitive revolution. They had languages capable of transmitting complex information. They had social networks that could share innovations across regions, and they had the cognitive flexibility to look at a problem and invent entirely new solutions. The Younger Dryas wasn't the end of humanity. In many ways, it was the beginning of something new. Because the strategies people developed to survive this climate crisis, the new ways of relating to plants and animals and landscapes, those strategies were going to lead directly to the most transformative change in human history. So what did they do? How did these stressed, struggling populations adapt to a world that kept changing the rules? The answer varies by region, because here's something crucial to understand. Humanity during this period wasn't one uniform culture. Different groups in different environments were facing different challenges and developing different solutions, and one of those solutions, emerging slowly over thousands of years in a few specific places, was going to change what it meant to be human. They were about to discover something that no human had ever systematically done before, something that would allow populations to grow beyond anything hunting and gathering could support, something that would eventually lead to villages, then towns, then cities, then everything we call civilization. They were about to figure out how to stay in one place. So here's what started happening in certain places around the world, beginning around 12,500 years ago. Small groups of humans, people who'd been nomads for 300,000 years, started doing something that would have seemed absolutely bizarre to their ancestors. They stopped moving, not all at once, not everywhere. But in specific regions where the conditions were just right, some human groups started spending more and more time in the same locations, returning to the same campsites not just seasonally, but year after year, then staying for multiple seasons, then eventually just staying. Let's focus on one place where we can see this transition most clearly. The Levant, that narrow strip of land on the eastern Mediterranean coast, encompassing parts of what's now Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, and Syria. This region, around 12,000 years ago, was uniquely positioned for this experiment in staying put. The climate here was Mediterranean, warm with seasonal rains. And crucially, this region was home to something remarkable. Wild grains. Wheat and barley growing naturally in dense stands across hillsides and valleys. Not the domesticated crops we know today, but they're wild ancestors. Plants that produced edible seeds in quantities that would have seemed like a miracle to people used to hunting scattered game and foraging for occasional plant foods. The people who lived here, archaeologists call them the Natufians, and they were among the first humans to seriously experiment with staying in one place. Imagine you're part of a Natufian group around 11,000 BCE. Your ancestors have been coming to this valley for generations. It's always been a good place to camp in late summer and fall when the wild grains ripen. You'd spend a few weeks here, harvesting the grain, then move on to other territories for the rest of the year. But something's changing in your generation. Maybe it starts with the older people, the ones who are tired of constant moving. Or maybe it's the children, the parents who are exhausted from carrying infants across miles of rough terrain. Or maybe it's just that the grains here are so abundant, so reliable, that it seems wasteful to leave. So your group decides to stay a little longer. Through the winter, maybe. You've got stored grain now, ground into flour and kept in baskets. Enough to last for months if you're careful. The hunting is decent in winter. There's water from a spring that never dries up. Why not stay? And then spring comes, and the plants around your camp start growing. The grains will ripen again in a few months. Maybe you should wait for the harvest before moving on. And then it's summer, and some of the older folks really can't travel anymore, and the children know this place. They've learned every rock and tree. They've made friends with children from other families in your band. Maybe you should just stay through another harvest. And before you fully realize what's happening, you've been in the same place for 3 years, then 5, then 10, and at some point you stop thinking about when you're going to move on. This isn't a camp anymore. This is home. The archaeological evidence for this transition is subtle but undeniable. Early Natufian sites from around 12,500 BCE show signs of seasonal occupation. Small, simple structures, limited material goods, the kind of things you could pack up and carry. But later sites from around 11,000 to 10,000 BCE, they're different. The structures are more substantial, built to last, and most tellingly, they're being rebuilt on the same spots over and over again. When a house collapses or burns down, people aren't moving to a new location. They're building a new house right on top of the old one. At a place called Ain Malaha, also known as Ainan, in what's now northern Israel, archaeologists found remains of a Natufian village that was occupied for over 1,000 years. Let that sink in. 1,000 years in the same location, the same families generation after generation being born, living, dying and being buried in the same small valley. The houses at Ain Malaha were round, about 3 to 6 metres in diameter. That's roughly 10 to 20 feet across. Small by modern standards, but substantial for the time. They had stone foundations, walls made from wood and reeds, and floors that were plastered and maintained, swept clean, repaired when they wore out. These weren't temporary shelters, these were homes, and building them required a completely different mindset than anything humans had done before. Think about the commitment involved in building a house with stone foundations. You're gathering rocks, some of them weighing dozens of pounds, and hauling them to your building site. You're digging into the ground to set them properly. You're shaping them to fit together. This isn't a couple hours of work, this is days, maybe weeks of labour. And you're only doing this if you believe you're going to be here long enough for it to be worth the effort. You're making a bet on the future. You're saying, I'm going to live here, my children are going to live here, maybe my grandchildren. That's a radical shift in human thinking. For 300,000 years, humans had been present-focused. Where will we camp tonight? Where will we hunt tomorrow? What will we eat this week? But building a house with stone foundations requires thinking in years and decades. And they were doing other things that showed this long-term thinking. They were making storage facilities, pits lined with stone or plaster, where they could keep harvested grain. These weren't small. Some of them could hold hundreds of pounds of food. Food for months. Food for times when hunting was poor or plants weren't available. Storage is another one of those deceptively simple innovations that actually represents a huge cognitive shift. If you're nomadic, you can't store much. You only keep what you can carry. But if you're staying in one place, suddenly storage makes sense. And once you start storing food, you start thinking differently about time. You start planning. You start asking questions like, How much grain do we need to harvest to get through winter? And if we save some of the best seeds, could we scatter them near our camp and have more plants next year? These questions, this kind of forward-thinking planning, it was laying the groundwork for agriculture. But we're not there yet. The Natufians were still harvesting wild plants. They weren't planting crops, not deliberately. They were just managing wild resources more intensively than anyone had before. And they had the tools to do it. Sickle blades, small stone blades, often made from geometric shapes called microliths, set into wooden or bone handles. You'd use these to cut through the stems of wild grains quickly and efficiently. Archaeologists can identify sickle blades because they develop a characteristic polish from the silica in plant stems. The more you use them, the shinier they get. They also had grinding stones, mortars and pestles for pounding grain, querns, flat stones where you'd use a rounded handstone to grind seeds into flour. If you've ever ground grain by hand, you know how labour-intensive this is. Your shoulders ache, your hands cramp. It takes hours to process enough flour for a family meal, but it was worth it. Because grain, unlike meat, can be stored, it won't spoil in a few days. You can accumulate surplus, create security, plan for lean times. This is why grains became so central to early agriculture. Not because they're the most nutritious foods, but because they're storable. They're future food, insurance against uncertainty. And the Natufians were starting to realise that living in one place gave them access to more of these resources than moving around did. If you're nomadic and you find a patch of wild wheat, you can harvest what you can carry and move on. But if you stay nearby, you can come back when the seeds ripen, harvest them carefully, make sure you're there at exactly the right time. You can even start weeding out competing plants, giving your wheat more room to grow. You're not farming yet, but you're managing. You're intervening in nature in new ways. But staying in one place created other challenges, big ones. Because humans, for all our history, had been adapted for small group living, bands of 20 to 40 people, mostly closely related. You knew everyone, you trusted everyone. Social coordination was based on kinship and personal relationships. Now, at these early Natufian settlements, you had populations of 100 people, maybe more. That's bigger than any human group had regularly lived in before, and you weren't all moving together anymore, so the group wasn't just your immediate family. It was multiple families, some related, some less so, all living in close proximity year-round. This created tension, serious social tension. When you're nomadic and there's a dispute, groups can split and move apart. Problem solved. But when you're sedentary, when you've invested years of labour in building your house and clearing your grain processing area and improving your storage pits, you can't just leave. You've got too much invested, so you need new social technologies, rules, norms, ways of resolving disputes that don't involve violence or splitting the group. This is where human culture started getting more complex, not out of some noble desire for progress, but out of simple necessity. Living together in large groups permanently required new social structures. We can see hints of this in the burial practices. The Natufians buried their dead, and they did it in specific, careful ways, often right under the floors of their houses. You'd dig a pit, place the body in it, sometimes with grave goods like shell beads or bone tools, then cover it over, and then you'd keep living in that house, literally on top of your ancestors. This isn't morbid, it's meaningful. It's saying, this place is ours, our ancestors are here, this is our territory, our home, in a way that transcends any individual life. Some burials show evidence of elaborate preparation. Bodies adorned with shell beads, hundreds of them, each one requiring hours of work to collect, drill and string. Some individuals were buried with headdresses made from dentalium shells, brought from the Mediterranean coast miles away. This wasn't just disposal of the dead. This was ritual. This was status differentiation. This was society getting more complex. And here's something else remarkable. Dogs. The Natufians were among the first people we know of who definitely lived alongside domesticated dogs. Not wolves anymore, but dogs. Animals that had been selectively bred, probably over thousands of years, to live with humans, to alert to dangers, to help with hunting, to be companions. At a site called Ain Malaha, archaeologists found a burial from around 12,000 years ago. An elderly person, probably a woman, buried with her hand resting on a puppy. The intimacy of that image, the care in that placement, It speaks to a relationship that goes beyond utility. These people loved their dogs. They mourned them. They buried them as members of the family. This bond between humans and dogs, it was deepening during this period of early settlement. Because dogs and humans, we were adapting to each other. Dogs were becoming more attuned to human social cues. Humans were learning to communicate with dogs. It was a partnership, one of the first true partnerships between humans and another species. And it was happening because staying in one place allowed these relationships to develop in ways that nomadic life didn't. The Natufians weren't alone in experimenting with settlement. Similar things were happening in other parts of the world, though we don't have as much evidence for them. In Japan, the Yomon culture was developing a sedentary lifestyle based on fishing, shellfish collection, and nut harvesting. They were making pottery, some of the earliest in the world as early as 16,000 years ago. Not for farming, but for storing and cooking wild foods. In China, groups along the Yellow River and Yangtze River were starting to stay in place longer, building more permanent structures, focusing more intensively on wild rice and millet. The exact timeline is debated, but the pattern is similar. In places where wild resources were abundant and reliable, humans were choosing to stay, and the key word there is choosing. Because this wasn't inevitable. Plenty of human groups, the majority of humans alive at this time, remained nomadic. They saw no reason to change a lifestyle that had worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Why commit to one place when the world was full of resources if you knew how to find them? The people who settled weren't more advanced or more intelligent. They were responding to specific environmental conditions. In the Levant, wild grains were abundant. In Japan, shellfish beds and salmon runs were predictable. In these contexts, staying made sense. Elsewhere, it didn't. But for the groups that did start staying, everything changed. Your relationship to the landscape changed. Instead of passing through territories, you were living in one intensively. You were learning every detail of a small area instead of having broad knowledge of a large region. Your sense of property changed. That house you built, that's yours. You made it. Your family lives in it. If someone else tries to move in, that's a violation. For the first time in human history, people were having to negotiate questions of ownership that went beyond personal possessions. Your relationship to food changed. You weren't just taking what nature provided anymore. You were managing resources, protecting the stands of wild grain near your village, scaring away animals that might eat them, making sure you harvested carefully so the plants would reseed for next year. You were, without necessarily realizing it, starting down a path that would lead to full agriculture, to deliberate planting, to crop domestication, to a complete transformation of the human relationship with nature. But that transformation wasn't going to happen quickly. It wasn't going to be smooth. It was going to take thousands of years of trial and error, of experimentation, of failure and adaptation, and gradual incremental change. Because the Natufians and other early sedentary groups, they weren't trying to invent agriculture. They were just trying to survive in a world that kept changing. They were just trying to eat, to take care of their families, to have enough food to get through the hard seasons. They had no idea they were laying the foundation for cities and kingdoms and everything we call civilization. They were just staying in one place, building houses that lasted, storing food for tomorrow, learning to live with 100 other people without killing each other. And in doing that, they were becoming something humans had never been before. They were becoming settlers, and there was no going back. So now you've got these groups of people staying in one place, building houses, storing food, living in villages of 100 or more people, and they're harvesting wild plants more intensively than any humans before them. But here's what you need to understand about what happened next. The story you might have heard about agriculture, the one where some genius ancient farmer decided to plant seeds and invented farming and changed the world, that's not what happened. That's not even close to what happened. What actually happened was messier, slower, and in many ways more interesting. Because for the next several thousand years, roughly from 9,000 to 7,000 BCE, humans were experimenting, trying things, figuring out what worked and what didn't, and most importantly, they had absolutely no idea they were inventing agriculture. They were just trying to eat. Let's stay in the Levant for a moment, because this is where we can trace the process most clearly. It's around 9,000 BCE. The Younger Dryas, that mini ice age, has just ended. The climate is warming again, stabilizing into the pattern we recognize today. And the people living in these early settlements are facing a challenge. There are more of them now. Sedentary life, it turns out, allows higher birth rates. When you're nomadic, you can only have one infant every 4 or 5 years. You can't carry more than one small child at a time. But when you're settled, when you're not moving constantly, you can have children closer together. Population growth speeds up. More people means you need more food, and while wild grains are abundant, they're not unlimited. If you're harvesting the same stands of wheat and barley year after year, you might be taking more than the plants can sustain. You need to figure out how to get more food from the same territory. So people start doing things that seem obvious in hindsight, but were revolutionary at the time. They start noticing which plants produce the most grain, which ones have the biggest seeds, which ones are easiest to harvest because the seeds don't scatter when you cut them. And when they're processing their harvest, sorting through the grain, they start saving some of those best seeds. Maybe at first just for eating later, but then someone has an idea. What if we scattered these seeds in a patch of disturbed ground near the village? The kind of ground where we've seen these plants grow before. So they try it, they scatter seeds, and the next year some of them grow, not all of them. Seeds are fragile, birds eat them, rodents dig them up, the weather might be wrong, but some grow, and that's encouraging. So they try again. More seeds, maybe in a better location. Maybe they clear away some of the competing plants first. They're not farmers yet, they're still harvesting mostly wild plants, but they're starting to intervene, they're starting to manage, and crucially, they're starting to select. Here's where it gets fascinating. When you preferentially save and plant seeds from plants with certain characteristics, you're changing the genetics of those plants. Not intentionally, not because you understand heredity or genetics, but the effect is the same. Wild wheat, the kind that grows naturally, has brittle stalks. When the seeds ripen, the slightest touch makes them scatter. This is good for the plant. It ensures the seeds spread widely, finding new ground to grow on, but it's terrible for humans trying to harvest. You touch the stalk and the seeds disappear into the grass, but there's natural variation. A few plants in any population will have mutations that make their stalks less brittle. In the wild, this is actually a disadvantage. Their seeds don't scatter as well, so they don't spread as effectively. But for humans harvesting, these plants are much easier to work with. So guess which plants humans preferentially harvest? The ones with less brittle stalks. And guess which seeds they accidentally drop on their way back to the village, or deliberately save for planting. Seeds from the plants with less brittle stalks. Over generations, over centuries, the wheat growing around these settlements is becoming less and less like wild wheat. It's being domesticated, not because anyone planned it, but because human selection pressure is changing which traits succeed. The same thing is happening with seed size. Bigger seeds produce bigger plants with more food. Humans notice this, consciously or not, and preferentially save bigger seeds. Over time, the average seed size increases. The plants are changing. And here's the thing, this is happening so slowly that no individual human notices. You harvest the same wheat your grandmother harvested, using the same techniques, in the same fields. You don't see the changes. But if you could compare the wheat from 9000 BCE to the wheat from 7000 BCE, 2000 years apart, you'd see clear differences. The later wheat has bigger seeds, less brittle stalks, and several other traits that make it more useful to humans and less able to survive in the wild. This process, this gradual, unintentional domestication, it's happening with multiple plants simultaneously. Barley, changing in the same ways as wheat. Lentils, becoming larger and easier to harvest. Chickpeas and peas, developing thin seed coats that don't need as much processing to be edible. Figs, possibly even earlier than grains, being propagated from cuttings near settlements. Each change is tiny. Each generation sees plants that look almost identical to what their parents grew. But the accumulation over centuries is transformative. And it's not just plants. Animals are being affected too, though the process is even more complex and harder to trace. Think about the relationship between humans and wild animals around these early settlements. There are herds of wild sheep and goats in the hills. They come down to graze in the valleys, maybe near the village where humans have cleared some land and the grass is growing thick. At first, humans just hunt them. But then someone notices that if you're careful, if you don't spook the whole herd, you can kill one animal and the others don't run far. They come back, so maybe you start being selective. Don't kill all of them. Leave some, especially the females who can have offspring. Take the aggressive males who cause trouble, but leave the calmer ones. You're not herding yet. Not really. These are still wild animals, but you're managing them at a distance, tolerating their presence near your settlement, even protecting them from other predators, because they are a resource you're planning to use later, And the animals, over generations, are changing too. The ones that tolerate human presence survive better in this environment than the ones that flee at the slightest sign of people. Natural selection is favouring tameness, docility, characteristics that in the pure wild might be disadvantages but near human settlements become advantages. The archaeological evidence for this process is subtle. We're looking at bones from settlements, trying to determine if they're from wild or domesticated animals. Early on they look wild. All age ranges, both sexes, the pattern you'd expect from hunting. But gradually the pattern shifts. More young males, fewer adult females. This suggests management, selective culling, the beginnings of herding. By around 8,500 BCE in the Zagros Mountains of Iran and Iraq, we start seeing populations of sheep and goats that are clearly being managed intensively. By 8,000 BCE, possibly earlier, there's evidence of morphological changes. Smaller body size, different horn shapes, changes that indicate these aren't wild animals anymore. But here's what's crucial to understand. This process isn't happening everywhere simultaneously. It isn't even happening consistently in the places where it starts. Human populations during this period aren't committed to agriculture yet. They're experimenting. And sometimes the experiments fail. Sometimes they abandon them. There are sites where we see evidence of cultivation for a few centuries, then it stops. The people go back to hunting and gathering. Why? Maybe the climate shifted and crops failed for a few years. Maybe disease wiped out their stored grain. Maybe there was social conflict and the village broke apart. Maybe they just decided the old way was better. Because here's the thing nobody talks about when they romanticize the agricultural revolution. Farming, especially early farming, was risky. It was labour-intensive. It was harder in many ways than hunting and gathering. If you're a hunter-gatherer in a good environment, you might work 3 to 5 hours a day finding food. The rest of the time is yours. But if you're an early farmer, you're working constantly, clearing land, planting, weeding, protecting crops from animals and birds, harvesting, processing, storing, maintaining your tools and your storage facilities. It's relentless, and it's risky. If you're a hunter-gatherer and one food source fails, you shift to another. But if you're a farmer and your crops fail, you might have nothing. You've invested months of labour in fields that produce nothing. Your stored grain is running out. Your children are hungry. And you can't just go back to hunting because you've spent the whole season farming instead of following the herds. Some groups that tried agriculture during this period decided it wasn't worth it. They went back to more mobile lifestyles. They kept some of the innovations, maybe continued to harvest wild versions of the plants they'd been cultivating, but gave up the intensive agriculture. Other groups persisted. They refined their techniques. They learned through generations of trial and error which plants grew best in which soils, when to plant for the best yield, how to store grain to minimize losses to pests, how to manage small herds of sheep or goats without them destroying nearby wild resources. And critically, different regions were experimenting with different plants and animals, because agriculture wasn't one invention. It was dozens of separate experiments happening in different parts of the world, with whatever local resources were available. In the highlands of Anatolia, in what's now Turkey, people were working with different varieties of wheat, along with rye. Rye, interestingly, probably started as a weed in wheat fields, but it grew better in poor soils and harsher climates, so in marginal areas, farmers gradually shifted to cultivating the weed instead of the crop. That's how unpredictable and pragmatic this process was. In the Zagros Mountains, the focus was more on herding sheep and goats, with barley and wheat cultivation secondary. The environment there was better suited to pastoralism. Steep hillsides, good for grazing but difficult to farm. So the balance between animals and plants was different. In China, something entirely separate was happening. Along the Yellow River in the north, people were experimenting with foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. These are grasses, like wheat and barley, but completely different species. In the Yangtze River Valley to the south, the focus was on rice. Wild rice, growing in wetlands, being harvested and eventually cultivated. The timeline in China is roughly similar to the Near East. By around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE, there's evidence of rice cultivation. By around 8,000 to 7,000 BCE, domesticated rice appears, showing the same kinds of changes we see in wheat. Larger grains, non-shattering seed heads, genetic changes driven by human selection. But the Chinese weren't in contact with the people in the Levant. They had no idea that halfway around the world, humans were doing something similar with different plants. This was independent invention. The same basic solution to the same basic problem worked out separately. In New Guinea, yet another separate trajectory. By around 9000 BCE, people were cultivating taro, yams, and bananas. These are vegetatively propagated crops. You don't plant seeds, you plant part of the plant itself. A taro corm, a yam cutting, a banana sucker. Different technique, different crops, same basic idea. Intensifying the productivity of useful plants through deliberate cultivation. In the Americas, still more, independent invention. In Mexico, people were experimenting with squash and gourds by around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. Not maize yet, that comes later, but they're learning to cultivate plants, modify environments, create gardens near their settlements. Each of these regions, each of these groups, they're working it out themselves. Trial and error, generation after generation. Nobody has a master plan. Nobody knows where this is leading, and within each region, there's variation. Some communities are enthusiastic early adopters, others are conservative, skeptical. Some try it and abandon it. Some never try at all, continuing to live as successful hunter-gatherers for thousands more years. The archaeological record from this period shows incredible diversity in human lifestyles. You've got fully sedentary villages practicing intensive cultivation. You've got semi-sedentary groups that farm part-time and hunt and gather the rest. You've got mobile pastoralists herding animals but not farming. You've got traditional hunter-gatherers who've incorporated a few domestic crops but are mostly still living the old way. And you've got hunter-gatherers who want nothing to do with any of it. This diversity is important, because the story of agriculture isn't a story of universal progress, where everyone recognizes that farming is better and adopts it. For many people, farming wasn't better. It was harder work for less reliable returns. They had good reasons to stick with hunting and gathering, but the groups that did adopt agriculture, even partially, they had something the others didn't. They could support larger populations, more children could survive, more people could live in a smaller area. And over generations, over centuries, those population differences added up. A farming village of 200 people could produce more farmers. A hunting band of 40 people couldn't produce more hunters without running out of territory. Slowly, incrementally, farming populations were growing relative to hunting populations. Not because farming made individual lives better, often it made them worse, but because it allowed more people to survive. This is the agricultural trap. Once populations grow beyond what hunting and gathering can support, you can't go back. You're locked in. You need to keep farming because there are too many mouths to feed any other way. But we're not there yet. Not in this period between 9000 and 7000 BCE. Populations are growing but slowly. The commitment to agriculture is still partial, still reversible. People are experimenting, learning, making mistakes, trying again. They're learning which plants need more water and which need less, which grow better in spring and which in fall, how to rotate crops so the soil doesn't become exhausted, how to use animal manure to fertilize fields, how to divert streams for irrigation, how to build terraces on hillsides to prevent erosion. None of this is written down. It's all passed along through demonstration and practice, parents teaching children, grandparents sharing memories of droughts and good years and what worked when. This is oral tradition becoming agricultural knowledge, accumulated slowly over millennia, and they're learning about animals too. How to breed them, which traits to select for, how to keep them healthy, how to maximize milk or wool or meat production. This knowledge is harder won than the plant knowledge because animals are more complex, more unpredictable, more demanding. But by 7000 BCE, in multiple regions around the world, humans have crossed a threshold. The plants and animals they're working with don't look like their wild ancestors anymore. They've been transformed by thousands of years of unintentional selection into something new, domesticated species, crops and livestock that can barely survive without human care. And the humans have been transformed too. Not genetically, not yet, though that's coming, but culturally. They've committed to a way of life that demands planning, patience, delayed gratification, and constant labour. They've tied themselves to specific pieces of land. They've created food surpluses that require protection, social structures that require maintenance, populations that require feeding. They weren't trying to invent agriculture, they were just trying to eat, trying to take care of their families, trying to survive in a world that kept changing. generation after generation, making tiny adjustments, saving seeds from the best plants, keeping the tamest animals close, not knowing they were slowly, accidentally transforming both the plants and themselves. By 7000 BCE, the experiment was working. It was messy, inconsistent, reversible in theory, but increasingly locked in by practice. And it was spreading. Not through conquest or deliberate dissemination, but through gradual population growth and the slow expansion of farming communities into new territories. The Forgotten Age was approaching its end. The foundations for everything that came after, cities and writing and kingdoms, they were being laid in these thousands of years of patient experimentation. But the costs were starting to become apparent too, and those costs were higher than anyone could have imagined. So you've got these communities learning to cultivate plants and manage animals. They're experimenting, figuring things out generation by generation. But staying in one place and producing food instead of just finding it, that created entirely new problems that nomadic hunter-gatherers never had to deal with, and solving those problems required inventing entirely new technologies. Let's think about what happens when you harvest hundreds of pounds of grain. You can't eat it all immediately, you need to store it. But how? If you're nomadic, you never had to worry about storing large quantities of food. You took what you could carry and moved on. But if you're settled, you've invested months of labour in growing crops, you need containers, lots of them. At first, people used what was available, baskets woven from reeds or grass. These work fine for carrying things, reasonable for short-term storage, but they have problems. Rodents can chew through them, water can seep in, they're fragile, wearing out after a season or two of use. Animal skins treated and sewn could work, but they're labour-intensive to make and maintain, and they're still vulnerable to pests and moisture. People needed something better, something waterproof, something that would keep grain dry through rainy seasons, something that couldn't be easily chewed through by mice or rats, something durable enough to last for years. They needed pottery. Now here's something fascinating about pottery. Humans knew about fired clay long before they started making pots. There's evidence from sites in Europe of small clay figurines being deliberately fired as early as 29,000 years ago. People understood that heating clay changed it, made it hard and permanent, but there's a huge gap between making a small decorative figurine and making a functional vessel for storing food. The technology's the same, but the purpose, the scale, the integration into daily life, that's completely different. The earliest pottery we know of comes from China. Sites dating to around 20,000 to 19,000 years ago have fragments of fired clay vessels. These early pots were probably used for cooking, maybe for rendering fat from animals, tasks that benefited from a container that could withstand fire. But pottery didn't spread from China to the rest of the world. Instead, it was invented independently in multiple places. In Japan, by around 16,000 years ago, the Jomon culture was making elaborate pottery with distinctive cord-marked patterns. In the Near East, pottery appears later, around 9,000 to 8,000 BCE. In Africa, pottery in the Sahara region by around 9,500 BCE. Each region invented pottery when the lifestyle demanded it. When people were staying in place long enough that making heavy, fragile containers made sense. When they needed to store food, cook grains that required long boiling, process resources in ways that mobile peoples didn't need to. Imagine you're in a Levantine village around 8,000 BCE, and someone in your community has figured out how to make these clay vessels. Maybe they noticed that clay from the riverbank, when shaped and left near a fire, became hard. Maybe they experimented with different clays, different shapes, different firing temperatures. You watch them work. They're digging clay from a specific spot where it has the right consistency. Too much sand and it crumbles. Too much silt and it cracks. They've learned through trial and error where the good clay is. They're mixing it with something, maybe crushed shells or ground up old pottery or plant fibers. These additions, archaeologists call them temper. They prevent the clay from cracking as it dries and fires. Each potter has their preferred recipe, knowledge passed from teacher to student. Then, the shaping. This is before the pottery wheel, which won't be invented for another 3,000 years. So everything is hand-built. They're rolling clay into long coils, stacking them in circles, smoothing the walls with their fingers and simple tools, building up a pot one layer at a time. The pot has to dry slowly, too fast, and it cracks. So they keep it in the shade, maybe covered with a damp cloth, letting the moisture escape gradually over days. Then comes the firing. They've built a fire, letting it burn down to hot coals. They place the dried pots carefully in the coals, then build the fire back up around them. The temperature has to get high enough to transform the clay permanently, typically around 700 to 900 degrees Celsius, but not so hot that the pots explode from thermal shock. The firing takes hours. The potter tends the fire carefully, maintaining the temperature, watching for problems, and when it's done, when the fire has burned down and the pots have cooled, you have something remarkable. A container that's waterproof, that won't rot or fall apart, that can hold grain through an entire winter without letting moisture in. That can be used to boil water, cook stews, render fat, brew beer. Pottery transforms food preparation. Suddenly you can cook grains in ways that make them more digestible, more nutritious. You can make porridge for children who are too young to chew whole grains. You can extract nutrients from bones by boiling them for hours. You can process plant foods that would be toxic raw but become safe when properly cooked. And you can store things: grain, dried fruit, seeds for planting, water. Each household in a farming village accumulates a collection of pots. Big ones for storage, medium ones for cooking, small ones for serving. Pottery becomes infrastructure, the foundation of settled life. But pottery is just one technology that staying in place demands. There are others, equally important, equally revolutionary in their own ways. Take textiles. Hunter-gatherers had clothing, obviously, but it was mostly animal hides, furs, leather. Effective but limited. You need to hunt animals to get the materials. Each garment represents a kill, hours of processing, careful sewing with bone needles and sinew thread. But if you're settling down, if you're starting to keep flocks of sheep or goats, you have access to something new: wool, or if you're in the right climate, plant fibers, flax, hemp, cotton, depending on the region. And with these fibers, you can weave, you can create textiles, cloth that's lighter than leather, more flexible, easier to wash, easier to repair, and you can make much more of it than you could ever make with animal hides. The earliest evidence of woven textiles is surprisingly old, but frustratingly rare because plant fibers decay quickly. We find impressions of fabric in clay, showing that textiles existed. We find spindle whorls, small weights used for spinning fiber into thread. We find loom weights, clay or stone objects used to tension the vertical threads on simple looms. By around 7000 BCE, people in the Near East were definitely weaving. They're creating linen from flax fibers. They're spinning wool from their domesticated sheep. They're making garments that don't require killing an animal first. Think about what's involved in making cloth from scratch. You start with raw fiber, flax stems or wool from shearing. This fiber has to be processed. Flax needs to be retted, soaked in water until the outer layers rot away, leaving the inner fibers. Then it's beaten, combed, prepared for spinning. Wool needs to be cleaned, removing dirt and oils, then carded, combed through special paddles with teeth that align the fibers and remove tangles. Then comes spinning. You're pulling out fibers, twisting them together while adding more fibers, creating a continuous thread. This is done with a drop spindle, a simple but effective tool, a stick with a weight on one end. You attach fibers, let the spindle drop while it spins, the rotation twisting the fibers into thread. Then you wind the thread onto the spindle and repeat. Over and over. A single garment might require miles of thread. Then, the weaving. You set up a loom, stretching vertical threads, the warp, under tension. Then you weave horizontal threads, the weft, over and under the warp threads, row after row, building up fabric. This is time-consuming work. It takes days to make enough cloth for a simple tunic, but settled life provides something crucial: time. Specifically, time that doesn't have to be spent moving camp or tracking animals across vast distances. Time that can be invested in slow, careful crafts. And textiles become important not just for practical clothing but for social signalling. You can dye cloth, creating colours: red from madder root, blue from woad, yellow from various plants. You can weave patterns, create designs that identify your family or village, make special garments for ceremonies. Cloth becomes valuable, tradable, something that can be given as gifts, used in marriages, hoarded as wealth. It's portable value, the foundation of early economies. Meanwhile, other technologies are evolving too. Stone tools, which humans had been making for millions of years, are changing in subtle but important ways. For most of human history, stone tools were made by chipping. You strike one rock with another, flaking off pieces until you get a sharp edge. This produces effective tools, but they're somewhat crude, useful for cutting, scraping, chopping, but limited in precision. But if you're farming, you need different tools. You need axes to clear trees, creating fields. You need adzes to shape wood for building. You need tools that can stand up to heavy, use without breaking. So stone tool makers start polishing. They're taking shaped stone tools and grinding them on abrasive stones, slowly, painstakingly, until the surface is smooth. This takes hours of work, much more than simple chipping. But the result is a tool that's stronger, sharper, more durable. Polished stone axes can fell trees. They can shape wooden beams for houses. They're still being used in some parts of the world into the 20th century because they work, and people are making grinding stones. Querns, flat stones used for grinding grain. These are heavy, some weighing 50 to 100 pounds. They're not portable. You're not carrying a quern around with you if you're nomadic. But if you're settled, if you're processing grain daily, you need good grinding stones, and you maintain them. You resurface them when they wear smooth. You pass them down through generations. Some settlements have communal grinding areas, flat rock surfaces where multiple querns are set up. Women, primarily, though we shouldn't assume gender roles were rigid, gathering to grind grain together, working side by side, talking, singing, turning hours of difficult labour into social time. This is another subtle change that settlement brings. Communal workspaces, shared infrastructure, the beginnings of public versus private space, and the architecture itself is evolving. Early Natufian houses were round, relatively small, semi-subterranean. But by 8000 to 7000 BCE, houses in many regions are becoming rectangular. This might seem like a trivial change, but it's not. Round houses are efficient for some purposes. They maximize space relative to wall length. They're structurally sound, but they're difficult to subdivide. If you want multiple rooms, round houses don't work well. Rectangular houses, though, you can partition. You can create storage rooms, sleeping areas, workspaces. The shift to rectangular architecture suggests growing complexity in how people are using domestic space. More specialization, more possessions, more need to organize and separate different activities, and some settlements are building beyond the domestic scale. At Jericho, as early as 8400 BCE, there's a massive stone tower, cylindrical, built against the settlement wall, about 8.5 meters tall, over 28 feet, made from roughly fitted stones, requiring coordinated labor from many people. Nobody knows exactly what this tower was for. Defense seems obvious, but the location is wrong for that. Maybe it was a watchtower, maybe it was ceremonial, maybe it was a demonstration of the community's power and organizational capability. What we do know is that building it required planning, leadership, and cooperation at a scale beyond any single household. This is communal architecture. This is society organizing itself to achieve goals beyond individual survival. And they're building other infrastructure too. Walls around settlements, though whether for defense or status display is debated. Plazas, open spaces for gatherings, storage facilities that serve multiple families, wells dug into the earth to access water even during dry seasons. All of this, every technology of settled life, represents a fundamental shift in human thinking. Because when you make a pot, you're planning for tomorrow. You're investing hours of work in creating something that will store grain for months. When you weave cloth, you're spending days creating a garment you'll wear for years. When you build a house with stone foundations, you're planning for decades. This is delayed gratification built into material culture. Every object embodies future-oriented thinking, and using these objects daily, maintaining them, planning around them, that reinforces this temporal orientation. It changes how humans think about time. Hunter-gatherers live more in the present. Where will we camp tonight? What will we eat today? Their possessions are few, their plans flexible. But farmers and settled people, they're constantly thinking forward. When should we plant? How much grain do we need to save for seed? Will the storage pots last another year, or do we need to make new ones? Should we add another room to the house before the baby comes? Every technology of settlement is also a technology of time, stretching human imagination forward into months and years instead of just days. And these technologies spread, not quickly, not systematically, but through contact between communities, through trade, through people moving from one village to another, carrying knowledge with them, through observation and imitation. A village that has pottery teaches pottery to neighbours. A community that's figured out efficient grain grinding shares that knowledge. Not because they're altruistic, but because trade and social ties benefit everyone. Because your daughter marries into another village and brings her skills with her. Because specialization emerges and the best potters trade their work for other goods. By 7000 BCE, in regions where settlement and agriculture had taken hold, there's a common technological package. Pottery, woven textiles, polished stone tools, substantial architecture, sophisticated storage systems, the material culture of farming life, but not everywhere. Plenty of human groups were still living as mobile hunter-gatherers, still using lighter, more portable technologies, still organized in small bands, and many of them were doing just fine, thank you. They looked at these settled communities with their back-breaking labor and their constant agricultural crises and their social tensions, and they wanted no part of it. The technologies of staying were remarkable innovations, but they came with costs that were becoming increasingly apparent, and we need to talk about those costs. Because the story of agriculture isn't just triumph, it's also sacrifice, it's trade-offs, it's humans choosing one way of life and losing another forever. So you've got these villages with their pottery and their looms and their substantial houses. Everything's looking pretty good from the outside. Humans have figured out how to stay in one place, produce food, build communities. Progress, right? Except there's a problem, a big one. And it's not about technology or food or climate. It's about people. Specifically about what happens when you force 100 or 200 humans to live together permanently when your species evolved to live in groups of 30 or 40. For 300,000 years, humans lived in intimate bands, small groups where everyone knew everyone, where you were related to most people by blood or marriage, where social coordination happened through kinship and personal relationships, where everyone saw each other daily, where reputation mattered more than rules because everyone knew what everyone else was doing. These bands were remarkably egalitarian. Sure, some people had more respect than others, skilled hunters, wise elders, gifted healers, but there was no permanent hierarchy, no chiefs who could command, no formal authority structures. If you didn't like the group dynamic, you could leave, join another band, form your own, and crucially, there was sharing. When someone killed a large animal, the meat was distributed, not equally necessarily, but broadly. The hunter got respect and first choice of cuts, but everyone ate. Hoarding food was impossible and pointless. You couldn't carry much, and keeping people hungry while you had plenty was a good way to become very unpopular very quickly. This egalitarian lifestyle worked for hundreds of thousands of years. It was stable, it was sustainable, and then humans settled down and everything changed. Imagine you're living in a village of 150 people around 8000 BCE. You know maybe 30 of them really well. Extended family, close neighbours, people you interact with daily. Another 30 you know reasonably well. Friendly acquaintances, people you see regularly. But the rest, you might recognise their faces, know their names, but you don't really know them. Not like you'd know everyone in a 20-person hunting band. This is unprecedented in human social experience, living surrounded by strangers, people who aren't kin, people whose motivations you don't fully understand, people who might not share your interests or values, and you can't just leave when there's conflict, because your house is here. The house you spent weeks building with stone foundations and plastered walls. Your storage pits are here, full of grain you harvested and processed. Your fields are here, planted and tended. Your family's work is invested in this place. Leaving means abandoning everything. So when there's a dispute, you have to resolve it somehow without fracturing the entire community. And disputes happen, constantly, because humans weren't designed for this level of social complexity. Someone's goats get into your grain storage. Who's responsible? Do they owe you compensation? How much? Who decides? Your neighbour's house fire spreads to yours. Was it an accident? Negligence? Do they need to help you rebuild? What if they refuse? Two families both claim the same plot of land for planting. They've both used it in previous years. Who gets it this season? How do you prevent this from escalating into violence? For the first time in human history, you need formal rules. Social institutions beyond kinship. Ways of resolving conflicts that don't rely on everyone involved being close relatives who fundamentally trust each other. And you need hierarchy. Someone or some group needs to have the authority to make decisions that stick, to say, this is how we're handling this, and have people accept it even if they're not happy about it. The archaeological evidence shows this happening. It's subtle, because social structures don't fossilize directly, but we can see their effects. Look at the burials. Early burials from semi-sedentary hunter-gatherer sites are relatively uniform. Some people get a few grave goods, shell beads, or a nice tool, but there's not massive differentiation. Everyone's buried with similar respect. But by 8000 to 7000 BCE in farming villages, burials are becoming strikingly different. Some individuals are buried with enormous wealth, hundreds of shell beads, multiple tools, imported objects from hundreds of miles away, elaborate ornamentation, special positions in important locations. Others are buried with nothing, simple pits, no offerings, minimal care. This is inequality. Clear, visible, systematic inequality in how communities treat their dead. And if people are buried differently, they were almost certainly treated differently in life. Some individuals had more status, more respect, more authority. Maybe they were leaders, people who made decisions for the community. Maybe they were religious specialists, shamans, or priests who mediated between humans and the divine. Maybe they were simply successful, better farmers who accumulated more wealth, skilled craft workers whose products were highly valued. Whatever the source of their status, these people had something others didn't. And when they died, the community marked that difference. The houses show inequality too. In earlier settlements, houses are roughly similar in size, but by the later periods some houses are notably larger, better built, located in preferred positions, while others are smaller, cruder, stuck in less desirable spots. This suggests wealth differentiation. Some families have more resources, can afford to build better, can claim better locations. The egalitarianism of hunter-gatherer bands is breaking down under the pressures of agricultural life. And here's why this happens. Agriculture creates storable wealth. When you harvest grain, you're creating a surplus. Food that can be saved, accumulated, controlled. And unlike meat from a hunted animal which spoils quickly and must be shared, grain can be kept, hidden, hoarded. For the first time in human history, some families can accumulate significantly more resources than others. Maybe they've got more workers, maybe they've got better land, maybe they're just luckier with weather and pests. But the successful families get richer. They can support more children, acquire more possessions, build larger houses, and the unsuccessful families get poorer. They struggle through bad harvests, lose children to hunger, fall into debt to the more successful families owing labour or resources. Property rights are solidifying. This field is mine. I cleared it, I planted it, I tend it. The grain it produces is mine, not the community's. If you want some, you need to trade for it or work for me. This is a radical departure from hunter-gatherer sharing, and it creates tension, resentment, social stratification that feels wrong to people whose ancestors lived as equals for hundreds of thousands of years. But it's also necessary for agricultural life to function. If you can't control the product of your labour, why would you invest months of work in farming? If anyone can take your stored grain, why bother storing it? Property rights, however uncomfortable, make agriculture viable. The tension between egalitarian instincts and agricultural necessity probably created constant friction in these early villages, and sometimes that friction erupted into violence. The skeletal evidence from this period shows a marked increase in trauma, healed fractures that suggest interpersonal violence, cranial injuries from being hit with blunt objects, cut marks on bones from weapons, mass graves suggesting massacres. At some sites, they're building defensive structures, walls around settlements, watchtowers, ditches. These take enormous labour to construct. You don't build a wall around your village unless you're genuinely worried about attack. Who's attacking? Sometimes it's probably other villages, competition for good land, raids for stored food or other resources, conflicts over territory that escalate into warfare. But sometimes it's probably internal violence too, disputes that can't be resolved peacefully, families feuding, individuals killing each other over slights and insults that in a mobile band could have been resolved by separation. Jericho's massive stone wall, built around 8400 BCE, encircles about 4 hectares. That's roughly 10 acres. It's built from undressed stone, up to 3.5 meters thick. That's over 11 feet of solid rock. The associated tower is 8.5 meters tall. Building this required thousands of person-hours of labour. You don't build something like that casually. You build it because you need protection. Or at least, because you believe you need protection, whether from external threats or as a way to project power and intimidate potential rivals. Other sites show similar fortifications at Tel es Sultan, at Beda, at various locations across the Near East. By 7000 BCE, defended villages are common enough to suggest that warfare, or at least the threat of it, is a regular feature of agricultural life. This is markedly different from most hunter-gatherer societies. Not that hunter-gatherers never fight, they do. But systematic warfare, organised violence between large groups over territory and resources, that's rare among mobile peoples. It's much more common among settled agricultural societies. Why? Because agriculturalists have something worth fighting over. Land, stored food, property that can be taken, and they can't easily move away from conflict because they're tied to their fields and villages. The archaeological record is also showing evidence of something else troubling: gender roles becoming more rigid, more unequal. Among hunter-gatherers, gender roles exist, but they're relatively flexible. Women typically do more gathering, men more hunting, but the divisions aren't absolute, and crucially, both contributions are essential. The gathered plant foods often provide more calories than hunted meat. Women's labour is valued. Their opinions matter in group decisions. But in agricultural societies, something shifts. The skeletal evidence shows it clearly. Starting around 9000 to 8000 BCE, women's skeletons show specific stress markers. Their knee joints show wear patterns consistent with kneeling for hours daily. Grinding grain. Their toe bones show changes from squatting. Their spines show stress from repetitive motions. They're working, constantly. Grinding grain is brutal labour. You're kneeling or sitting, pushing a heavy stone back and forth across another stone, processing enough flour for your family's daily bread. It takes hours. Your shoulders ache, your hands cramp, your knees hurt, and you do it every single day. Meanwhile, men are doing agricultural labour, clearing fields, ploughing, heavy work, but it's more varied. And the social roles are changing too. Men are increasingly associated with public activities, council meetings, trading expeditions, warfare, while women are increasingly confined to domestic spaces, the household, the grinding stone, child-rearing. This isn't universal. Different societies handle gender differently, but the pattern is clear enough across multiple regions. Agricultural life, for whatever complex of reasons, tends to restrict women's roles more than hunting and gathering did. Maybe it's because agricultural societies have higher birth rates. Women are pregnant more often, nursing more children, stuck closer to home. Maybe it's because property and inheritance become important, and patrilineal systems emerge to keep land in male lineages. Maybe it's simply that the division of agricultural labour falls along gender lines and becomes entrenched over generations. Whatever the causes, the effects are measurable. Women's health declining, their social autonomy restricting, their lives becoming more circumscribed, and everyone's health is declining, not just women's. The skeletal evidence across the board shows that early agriculturalists were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They're shorter. Average height drops by several inches in populations that adopt agriculture. This is a clear sign of nutritional stress during childhood. When you're not getting adequate nutrition, you don't grow to your full genetic potential. They have more dental disease, cavities, abscesses, tooth loss. Hunter-gatherers eating varied diets of meat and wild plants have remarkably good teeth. But agriculturalists eating soft, carbohydrate-rich diets of cultivated grains have terrible teeth. The constant exposure to sugars and starches creates ideal conditions for decay. They have more indicators of childhood stress. Harris lines on bones, showing periods when growth stopped temporarily due to malnutrition or disease. Enamel hypoplasias on teeth, horizontal grooves showing the same thing. Early farmers are experiencing frequent nutritional crises. They have higher rates of infectious disease, living in larger, denser populations, living close to domesticated animals. These are ideal conditions for pathogens to spread. Diseases that could barely sustain themselves in scattered hunting bands thrive in agricultural villages. They're working harder. The bone stress markers show it. Arthritis at younger ages, joint wear from repetitive labour. Agricultural life is physically demanding in ways hunting and gathering wasn't. They're living shorter lives. Average life expectancy at birth may have dropped from the mid-30s to the late 20s in some early agricultural populations. Not dramatic, but significant. And a lot of that is infant mortality, disease spreading through villages, malnutrition making children vulnerable. By almost every measure we can assess from skeletal remains, the first farmers were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. They were shorter, sicker, worked harder, died younger, and experienced more pain and disease throughout their lives. So why did they keep doing it? If agriculture made life worse, why didn't they just go back to hunting and gathering? Because they couldn't. This is the trap. The agricultural trap that locked humanity into this new way of life, even though it made individual lives harder. Agriculture allows higher population density. A village of 200 farmers living on agricultural land can exist where only 40 hunter-gatherers could survive. Once your population grows to 200, you can't go back to hunting and gathering. There isn't enough wild game and wild plants to support that many people in the same territory. You're stuck. You need to keep farming because there are too many mouths to feed any other way. Even though farming makes each individual life harder, even though you're working more for less health and less happiness, you do it because the alternative is starvation. And once a population is locked into agriculture, it has a competitive advantage in raw numbers. 200 farmers can expand into new territory, clearing forest, planting fields, establishing new villages. 40 hunter-gatherers can't compete with that. They get pushed into marginal lands, absorbed into agricultural populations, or sometimes wiped out entirely. This isn't inevitable everywhere. Some hunter-gatherer populations successfully resist agriculture for thousands of years. Some environments favour hunting and gathering over farming. But where agriculture takes hold, it tends to spread. Not because it makes better lives, but because it makes more lives. And the people living through this transition, the ones in the villages around 8000 to 6000 BCE, they're experiencing all these costs firsthand. The social tensions, the inequality, the violence, the declining health, the harder work. They don't know about population traps or evolutionary advantages. They just know life is difficult. Their grandparents talk about the old days when people moved freely and shared everything. But those days are gone. The village is here. The fields need tending, the grain needs grinding, the social rules need following, and there's no going back. The choice was made, not by any individual, not even consciously by any generation, but collectively, incrementally, over thousands of years of small decisions that accumulated into a fundamental transformation of human life. Settlement didn't just change where people lived, it changed what it meant to be a person. Changed relationships from kinship-based equality to property-based hierarchy. Changed social structures from flexible bands to rigid villages. Changed gender relations from complementary roles to increasingly unequal ones. The forgotten age between survival and civilization, these 7,000 years of experimentation and adaptation, they were laying the foundations for everything that came after. But those foundations were built on sacrifice, built on harder work, built on accepting inequality and violence and declining health as the price of staying in one place. And yet people kept building, kept farming, kept adapting to this new way of life, because humans are nothing if not resilient, and because mixed in with all the costs, there were benefits too, benefits that would only become apparent over generations. So we've been focusing on the Near East, on the Levant and surrounding regions, because that's where we have the most detailed evidence for this transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture. But here's what makes the story of agriculture truly remarkable. It wasn't just happening there, it was happening all over the world, independently, in places so far apart that the people involved couldn't possibly have known what others were doing, at least 7 times, in 7 different regions across the globe. Human populations looked at their local plants and animals and made the same fundamental decision. To cultivate instead of just harvest, to manage instead of just hunt, to stay instead of move, each time with different crops, different animals, different techniques, different challenges, but the same basic result, the transformation from mobile hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. Let's take a journey, let's visit these different places and see what was happening while those Near Eastern villages were grinding their wheat and herding their goats. First, China. Travel east across the vast expanse of Asia, across deserts and mountains and grasslands, until you reach the great river valleys of China. The Yellow River in the north, the Yangtze River in the south. 2 completely different environments, and 2 completely different agricultural traditions emerging independently. In the north, along the Yellow River. Picture yourself around 9000 to 8000 BCE. The landscape here is different from the Levant. Cooler, drier. The dominant wild plants aren't wheat or barley. They're millets, two species specifically, foxtail millet and broomcorn millet. These are small-seeded grasses, much smaller than wheat. But they have advantages. They grow quickly, maturing in just 2 to 3 months. They're drought-resistant, surviving in the semi-arid conditions of northern China where other crops might fail. They don't need much in the way of soil preparation or water management. The people here are experimenting with cultivating these millets in much the same way Near Eastern people were experimenting with wheat, saving seeds from the best plants, scattering them near their settlements, gradually over generations creating domesticated varieties that look different from their wild ancestors, bigger seeds, less shattering, more reliable yields. By 8000 to 7000 BCE, millet agriculture is established across northern China. Villages are forming, pottery is being made in distinctive styles. People are settling down, committed to this way of life, but travel south, down to the Yangtze River Valley. Here the environment is completely different. Warm, wet, almost tropical in summer. And the crop that matters here isn't millet, it's rice. Wild rice grows naturally in wetlands throughout southern China and Southeast Asia. It's been harvested by humans for thousands of years. But around 9000 to 8000 BCE, some groups start cultivating it deliberately, managing water levels, creating paddy fields, selecting for varieties that produce more grain and don't shatter as easily. This is harder than millet cultivation. Rice paddies require sophisticated water management. You need to control flooding, create level fields, build irrigation channels and drainage systems. It's labour-intensive, demanding, technically complex. But the yields are extraordinary. Rice can support much higher population densities than almost any other crop. A single good rice paddy can feed a family for a year. The caloric return for the labour invested is remarkable. By 7000 BCE, domesticated rice appears in the archaeological record. Grains that show clear genetic changes from wild rice. Villages growing rice as their staple crop. Population density increasing beyond anything possible with hunting and gathering. Two agricultural systems in China, both emerging independently, both adapted perfectly to their local environments, neither having anything to do with what's happening in the Near East. Now travel halfway around the world, to Mesoamerica, what will eventually become Mexico and Central America. Here, between 9000 and 5000 BCE, yet another agricultural revolution is unfolding. And this one is perhaps the most impressive of all, because the crops being domesticated are so radically different from their wild ancestors. Imagine you're in the highlands of southern Mexico around 7000 BCE. The people here have been experimenting with various plants for thousands of years. Squash, domesticated early, used for containers and for their seeds. Beans, providing essential protein. But the crop that will transform this region hasn't appeared yet in its fully domesticated form. It's called maize, corn. And it will become one of the most important crops in human history, but right now it doesn't exist. Not as we know it. What does exist is a wild grass called teosinte. Small, unimpressive, with tiny ears bearing maybe 5 to 12 seeds enclosed in hard shells. It looks nothing like corn. If you didn't know what you were looking for, you'd walk right past it. But somehow, over thousands of years, through generations of selection, humans transformed teosinte into maize. This is one of the most dramatic domestications ever achieved. The plants look so different that botanists argued for decades about whether they were even related. The process required intense selection, choosing plants with more kernels, softer seed coats, bigger cobs, changes in how the plant grew, how it reproduced, everything. By 5000 BCE, recognizable maize appears. Still not the giant ears we know today, but clearly domesticated, clearly a crop designed by human selection. And they're doing this without large domesticated animals. In the Near East you've got sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. In China, pigs and water buffalo. But in Mesoamerica, there are no large native animals suitable for domestication. The wild horses and camels that once lived here went extinct at the end of the Ice Age. What's left? Deer, peccaries, tapirs. None of them particularly amenable to domestication. So Mesoamerican agriculture develops without animal power. No plows pulled by oxen, No transportation by horse or donkey. Everything done by human muscle. And yet, they still create one of the most productive agricultural systems in the world. Maize, beans, and squash grown together. The three sisters, each crop supporting the others. Beans fixing nitrogen in the soil, squash shading the ground, suppressing weeds, maize providing structure for beans to climb. It's elegant, efficient, and completely independent of anything happening anywhere else. Travel south, down through Central America, across the narrow isthmus, into South America. Here, two more independent centers of agriculture are emerging, one in the Andes Mountains, one in the Amazon basin. In the Andes, the challenge is altitude. Some of these valleys sit at 3,000 to 4,000 meters above sea level. That's 10,000 to 13,000 feet. The air is thin. Temperatures drop below freezing at night. Most crops can't grow here. But there's a plant that can. Potatoes. Wild potatoes, small and bitter, growing in the highlands, and starting around 8,000 to 7,000 BCE, people are experimenting with them, selecting for varieties that are less bitter, more productive, easier to store. By 6,000 to 5,000 BCE, domesticated potatoes appear, not just one variety, dozens, hundreds eventually, each adapted to specific microclimates, specific altitudes. The diversity of Andean potatoes is staggering. Some grow at sea level, some at over 4,000 meters, some store well, some are best eaten fresh, some are freeze-dried into chuño, a preserved form that can last for years. They're also domesticating quinoa, a high-protein grain that thrives at altitude. Llamas and alpacas, the only large domesticated animals native to the Americas. These camelids provide wool, meat, and crucially, transportation. Pack animals that can navigate mountain trails no horse could manage. Meanwhile, down in the Amazon lowlands, entirely different crops. Manioc, also called cassava, a starchy root that thrives in poor tropical soils. Sweet potatoes, various fruits and nuts. These Amazonian peoples are creating garden agriculture, cultivating multiple crops in complex arrangements that mimic and enhance the natural forest. This is so different from field agriculture that for a long time archaeologists didn't even recognize it as agriculture. They thought Amazonian peoples were just hunter-gatherers. But increasingly, evidence shows they were managing forests intensively, planting useful trees, encouraging certain plants, creating artificial soil called terra preta, enriched with charcoal and organic matter that's more fertile than the natural forest floor, crossed the Atlantic to Africa. Here, multiple agricultural traditions are emerging independently, because Africa is huge and environmentally diverse. What works in one region might be useless in another. In the highlands of Ethiopia, people are domesticating teff, a tiny grain that becomes the staple of the region. They're cultivating enset, the false banana, a starchy plant that can sustain large populations. Coffee, though it won't become important for thousands of years yet. In West Africa, Indus, the Niger River Valley and surrounding regions, different crops. Sorghum, a drought-resistant grain perfectly adapted to semi-arid climates. Pearl millet, even more drought-resistant. African rice, domesticated independently from Asian rice, a completely separate species. Yams, starchy tubers that thrive in tropical conditions. And they're domesticating cattle. African cattle, descended from wild aurochs, the same species that gave rise to Near Eastern cattle, but domesticated separately. Selected for different traits, adapted to different diseases, different climates. By 6,000 to 5,000 BCE, agricultural societies are spreading across the African Sahel. This is before the Sahara fully deserts. During wetter periods, the Sahara is green, crossable, home to rivers and lakes and the humans who farm and herd there. Travel east again, to New Guinea, that large tropical island north of Australia. Here, in one of the most challenging agricultural environments imaginable, dense rainforest with poor soils and constant rain, people are creating yet another independent agricultural system. The crops here are entirely different from anywhere else. Taro, a starchy corn grown in wet conditions. Yams, different species from the African ones. Bananas, domesticated from wild varieties. Sugarcane, sago palm. And the techniques are unique. These aren't seed crops. They're vegetatively propagated. You don't plant seeds, you plant part of the plant itself. A taro corm, a yam cutting, a banana sucker. This requires different knowledge, different agricultural techniques, different seasonal timing than seed agriculture. Evidence suggests this New Guinea agriculture is remarkably old, possibly starting as early as 9,000 to 7,000 BCE, making it contemporary with Near Eastern agriculture. These tropical forest dwellers, working with completely different plants in a completely different environment, figuring out agriculture at the same time as people half a world away. There's even evidence, debated but intriguing, of agricultural experimentation in eastern North America. Along the Mississippi and its tributaries, people cultivating sunflowers for their seeds, squash, probably introduced from Mesoamerica but adapted locally, some native grains, barley, sumpweed, goosefoot, creating a minor agricultural tradition that flourishes for a few thousand years before being largely abandoned in favour of maize agriculture, introduced from the south. 7 independent inventions, 7 different regions, 7 different sets of crops and animals, each perfectly adapted to local conditions, each emerging over thousands of years of experimentation, each transforming human societies in similar ways despite using completely different resources. This parallel evolution is extraordinary. It suggests something fundamental about humans and agriculture. This wasn't a lucky accident that happened once and spread. This was a solution that humans in many different places, facing many different challenges, arrived at independently. When populations became sedentary or semi-sedentary, when they stayed in place long enough to manage resources intensively, when population pressure created demand for more reliable food sources, agriculture emerged, not everywhere, not inevitably, but in multiple places where conditions were right and humans were willing to experiment. And the diversity of solutions is beautiful. Rice paddies in southern China look nothing like maize fields in Mexico. Potato terraces in the Andes function completely differently from sorghum cultivation in West Africa. New Guinea taro gardens have nothing in common with wheat fields in the Levant, but they're all agriculture. They're all humans making the same fundamental choice, to bind themselves to specific plants and places, to invest labour in cultivation rather than just harvesting wild resources, to create food surpluses and support larger populations. The technique spread, of course. Once agriculture existed, it could move. Wheat from the Levant eventually spread into Europe, Central Asia, North Africa. Rice from China spread throughout Southeast Asia. Maize from Mesoamerica eventually reached both North and South America. But the initial inventions were independent, each region working it out for themselves, each making their own mistakes, finding their own solutions, adapting to their own circumstances. And here's what's crucial. Not everywhere adopted agriculture at the same time. While some regions were fully committed to farming by 7,000 or 6,000 BCE, other places remained successfully hunter-gatherer societies for thousands of years longer, some into the present day. Australia's Aboriginal peoples never adopted agriculture, not because they couldn't, but because they didn't need to. Their sophisticated land management practices, their deep knowledge of native plants and animals, their carefully maintained trading networks, these provided everything they needed. Agriculture would have been a step down in quality of life, not up. Many Arctic peoples remained hunters and fishers. The environment simply didn't support agriculture. Frozen ground, short growing seasons. Agriculture was impossible or impractical. They developed incredibly sophisticated technologies for survival in extreme conditions, but farming wasn't part of it. Even in regions where agriculture was available, some groups chose not to adopt it. Hunter-gatherers along rich coastal areas, with reliable fish runs and shellfish beds, often saw no reason to start farming. Why break your back ploughing fields when the ocean provides abundant protein? So by 5000 BCE, the world is a patchwork. Agricultural societies in some regions, hunter-gatherers in others, pastoralists specializing in herding, groups combining all 3 strategies, no single way of life dominating, no inevitable march toward farming. But the agricultural regions were growing, populations expanding, cleared land spreading, villages becoming towns, social complexity increasing, the foundations being laid for the cities and kingdoms that would emerge in the next few millennia. 7 different paths, each starting with local plants and local conditions, each shaped by thousands of years of accumulated knowledge and experimentation, each creating societies that looked different, valued different things, organized themselves in different ways, but all of them agricultural, all of them settled, all of them committed to staying in one place and producing food rather than finding it. The Forgotten Age was creating agricultural humanity, not in one place, not in one way, but globally, diversely, simultaneously across the planet. And within another few thousand years, some of these agricultural societies would take the next step. They would create writing, build cities, form kingdoms, enter recorded history. But none of that would have been possible without these thousands of years of experimentation, without the rice farmers of China and the maize cultivators of Mexico, without the potato growers of the Andes and the yam farmers of West Africa, without the taro gardeners of New Guinea and the wheat farmers of the Levant. They were all, each in their own way, inventing the world we live in today, creating the agricultural foundation that every civilization since has been built upon. So we've travelled the world, seen agriculture emerging independently in 7 different regions. But there's something we haven't talked about yet, something that's harder to see in the archaeological record but might be the most important change of all. What happened to the human mind during this transition? How did settling down and cultivating plants change not just how people lived, but how they thought, what they believed, how they understood their place in the universe? Because agriculture isn't just a change in how you get food, it's a fundamental transformation in your relationship with time, with nature, with the forces that control your survival. And that transformation required, maybe even created, entirely new ways of thinking about the world. Let's start with something that should seem obvious but is actually profoundly strange. When you plant a seed, you're making a bet on the future. You're taking something you could eat today, something with immediate value, and you're putting it in the ground. Gambling that months from now, if everything goes right, you'll get more seeds back. Think about what that requires psychologically. You need to be able to imagine a future that doesn't exist yet. Not just tomorrow or next week, but months away. You need to trust that the seasons will continue their cycle, that rain will come when it's needed, that the sun will shine but not too intensely, that pests and diseases won't destroy everything, that you'll still be alive and here to harvest what you planted. Hunter-gatherers don't think this way. Not typically, they're more present-focused. Where's the game today? What plants are ripe now? Their planning extends days, maybe weeks, but farmers need to think in seasons, in years, in agricultural cycles that stretch across their entire lives. And when you're thinking about the future that much, when your survival depends on things beyond your control happening correctly, you start asking different questions. Why did the rains fail this year? What determines whether seeds sprout or rot in the ground? How can we ensure good harvests? You can control some things, you can clear land carefully, plant at the right time, weed diligently. But so much is beyond control. Weather, disease, locusts, events that can destroy months of work in hours. And humans, we're pattern-seeking creatures. We need explanations. We need to believe there's some order to chaos, some way to influence outcomes. So we create systems of belief that give us that sense of control, even if it's indirect. We invent gods. Not that hunter-gatherers don't have spiritual beliefs. They absolutely do. Animistic traditions that see spirit in animals, in trees, in rivers and rocks. Shamanic practices where specially gifted individuals can communicate with the spirit world. These are sophisticated, meaningful belief systems. But agricultural spirituality is different. It's focused on fertility, on growth, on the cycle of planting and harvest, on the forces that determine whether crops thrive or fail. And it creates new kinds of religious practices, new kinds of sacred spaces, new relationships between humans and the divine. The evidence for this spiritual transformation is scattered across the archaeological record. Figurines showing up in increasing numbers, buildings that serve no obvious practical purpose, burials that suggest elaborate beliefs about death and afterlife, art that depicts things beyond simple representation of the physical world. But there's one site that stands above all others in making this transformation visible, a place that challenges everything we thought we knew about the relationship between agriculture and religion. It's called Göbekli Tepe, and it's in southeastern Turkey, not far from the Syrian border. The name means potbelly hill in Turkish, which is charmingly mundane for what might be the most important archaeological site discovered in the last 50 years. Imagine you're standing on this hill around 9600 BCE. That's 11,600 years ago. The Younger Dryas has just ended. The world is warming. But agriculture hasn't been fully invented yet. People in this region are still primarily hunter-gatherers, harvesting wild grains, hunting gazelles and wild sheep. And on this hill, they're building something extraordinary. Massive stone circles, pillars carved from limestone, some weighing up to 16 tons. 20 of them arranged in circles, with 2 even larger pillars in the centre. The pillars are T-shaped, roughly hewn, but deliberately formed, and they're covered with carvings, animals, dozens of species, gazelles, foxes, wild boar, snakes, scorpions, birds, spiders. The carvings are sophisticated, showing real artistic skill. Some animals are shown in relief, seemingly leaping off the stone. Others are abstract symbols whose meanings we can only guess at. And here's what's remarkable. This isn't a settlement. Nobody lived here. There are no houses, no hearths, no trash pits full of domestic debris. This is a special place, a sacred place. Somewhere people came to periodically for ceremonies, rituals, gatherings. Building it required coordinating hundreds of workers, quarrying those massive stones, moving them, some from kilometres away, carving them, erecting them in precise arrangements, all before pottery, before agriculture, before any of the other technologies we associate with complex societies. This shouldn't be possible. The old story of human development said you needed agriculture first, settled communities creating food surpluses, then some people could specialise, including religious specialists. Then you could build monuments and temples, but Göbekli Tepe reverses that sequence entirely. These are hunter-gatherers building monuments, creating sacred architecture on a massive scale, before they'd figured out how to farm. And it's not alone. Nearby sites show similar structures from similar periods. Smaller, less elaborate, but clearly part of the same tradition. There's something happening in this region in the centuries around 10,000 to 9,000 BCE. Some flowering of religious architecture and practice among people who are still mobile, still hunting and gathering. What were they doing here? We don't know for certain, but we can make informed guesses based on the evidence and comparisons with other societies. Maybe these were gathering places, multiple groups coming together at certain times of year, for trade, for finding marriage partners, for sharing information, creating and maintaining social ties that linked scattered populations across hundreds of kilometres. Maybe they were ritual centres, places where shamans or priests performed ceremonies essential to the community's well-being, rites to ensure successful hunts, to promote fertility, to maintain cosmic order. Maybe they were teaching sites, where knowledge was transmitted through elaborate ceremonies, stories encoded in the animal carvings, myths explaining the origin of the world, the relationship between humans and nature, the proper way to live. Probably all of these and more. Sacred spaces in pre-agricultural societies serve multiple functions: religious, social, educational, economic. They're where the community becomes more than just scattered individuals, where collective identity is created and reinforced. But here's the really intriguing theory. Maybe building these sites, maybe the need to gather regularly at these sacred places, maybe that's what drove agriculture, not the other way around. Think about it. You're a group of hunter-gatherers who travel to Göbekli Tepe every year for important ceremonies. While you're there, you're camping nearby for days or weeks, and you're not alone. There are hundreds of other people from dozens of other groups. All of you need to eat. Feeding that many people from wild resources is difficult. Really difficult. You'd strip the area clean in days, so you start looking for ways to produce more food more reliably around your gathering site. You start deliberately cultivating the wild grains that grow nearby. You start managing the wild sheep and goats so there are always animals available for ceremonial feasts. You're not farming yet, not permanently, but you're intensifying resource production around a sacred site, and that intensification, repeated over generations, gradually becomes agriculture. This flips the traditional story. It says religion came first, the human need for meaning, for ceremony, for sacred gathering places, and agriculture developed as a byproduct, a solution to the logistical challenges of supporting those gatherings. We don't know if that's exactly what happened, but the existence of Göbekli Tepe proves that the relationship between agriculture and complex society isn't as simple as we thought. Hunter-gatherers were capable of much more sophisticated social organisation than we'd imagined. And over the next few thousand years, as agriculture did develop and spread, spirituality evolved with it. The kinds of beliefs people held, the kinds of gods they worshipped, these changed to reflect agricultural realities. Fertility becomes central, not surprising. Your survival depends on seeds sprouting, on animals reproducing, on the earth being fertile. So you create rituals and deities focused on promoting fertility. Female figurines appear across agricultural sites throughout this period. The famous Venus figures, though that name is misleading since they predate the Greek goddess Venus by thousands of years. These are carved or modelled representations of women, often with exaggerated breasts, hips and bellies, clearly pregnant or deliberately emphasizing reproductive features. At Çatalhöyük, a site in central Turkey occupied from around 7400 to 5800 BCE, they found dozens of these figurines. Some show women giving birth, others show women sitting, standing, or in various poses. There are also figurines of animals, particularly cattle, also often pregnant or with exaggerated reproductive features. What do these mean? The traditional interpretation was fertility goddesses, representations of divine feminine power, Earth Mother figures worshipped to ensure good harvests and healthy children. But some archaeologists push back on this. Maybe they're not goddesses, maybe they're ancestors, representations of important women in the community's past, or maybe they're teaching tools used to educate young women about pregnancy and childbirth, or maybe they're simply art, explorations of the human form without necessarily being religious. The truth is, we don't know. These people didn't leave written explanations. We're interpreting artifacts without instruction manuals. But what's clear is that the female form, particularly the pregnant female form, held significance in early agricultural societies. Enough significance that people spent time and skill creating these representations, and there's other evidence of spiritual transformation, burial practices becoming more elaborate, more standardized, more clearly expressing beliefs about death and what comes after. At Çatalhöyük, people buried their dead under the floors of their houses. You'd dig a pit beneath the sleeping platform, place the body in it, sometimes with grave goods, sometimes without, then cover it over and continue living in the house. Literally living on top of your ancestors. Some bodies were treated differently. Excarnated first, the flesh removed or allowed to decay, then the bones carefully arranged. Skulls sometimes removed and plastered, creating lifelike faces on actual human skulls. These plastered skulls show up at multiple sites across the Levant. They're clearly important, though what exactly they mean is debated. This suggests ancestor veneration. The dead aren't simply disposed of. They remain part of the household, part of the community. Their presence is maintained, honoured. They're still there in some sense, still connected to the living. And this makes sense in agricultural contexts. Because you're tied to land now, your fields are here, your house is here, and your ancestors were here before you. They cleared this land, planted these fields, built this house. Maintaining their presence, honouring them, it reinforces your connection to place. It says this land is ours, has been ours, will continue to be ours because our ancestors are in it. Religious spaces are also changing. They're becoming more formal, more architecturally distinct. At Çatalhöyük, certain rooms show evidence of special use. Wall paintings depicting hunting scenes, geometric patterns, possibly religious symbols. Installations of cattle horns and skulls, benches and platforms suggesting spaces for ritual activities. These aren't separate temples yet, but they're rooms within houses that have been designated as sacred, set apart for spiritual purposes. The beginning of the division between sacred and profane space, and the art itself is becoming more symbolic, more abstract. Cave paintings from the Paleolithic were representations, beautiful, skilled, but depicting actual animals. But the art appearing on walls of agricultural settlements is different. Geometric patterns, repeated motifs, symbols whose meanings aren't obvious. This suggests abstract thought operating at new levels, the ability to create representations that stand for concepts, not just things. This cross means something. This spiral means something. These aren't just decorations, they're meanings encoded in visual form. Rituals are becoming more regular, more calendrical, because agriculture runs on seasons. You plant at specific times, harvest at specific times. The agricultural year has a rhythm, and religious practice fits into that rhythm. Planting ceremonies, first fruits offerings, harvest festivals, the cycle of the year becoming the framework for religious life. And humans are starting to think about gods differently, not just spirits in nature, but beings with agency, with desires and demands. Gods who need to be appeased, honoured, negotiated with. Gods who control the rain and the sun and the fertility of crops and animals. You make offerings. You perform rituals. Not just because they're traditional, but because you believe they work. Because when you performed the rain ceremony last year and it rained, you made a connection. You'll do it again this year. And if it doesn't rain, maybe you didn't do it correctly. Maybe the gods need more, a better offering, a more elaborate ceremony. This is magical thinking. But it's also the foundation of religion as we know it, the belief that human actions can influence divine powers, that through proper ritual and offering we can secure divine favour, that there's a transaction possible between humans and gods, and underlying all of this is that fundamental shift in temporal thinking. When you plant a seed, you're thinking months ahead. When you store grain for winter, you're thinking seasonally. When you teach your children farming techniques, you're thinking generationally. When you bury your ancestors under your house and maintain their skulls, you're thinking across multiple generations, connecting past and future through the present. This extended time horizon, this ability to think deeply into past and future, it changes everything about human cognition. It makes planning possible at scales nomadic peoples rarely needed. It makes complex social institutions possible, because you can think about maintaining them across generations. It makes civilization possible ultimately because civilization is nothing if not the accumulation of efforts across time. The spiritual transformation of the Forgotten Age wasn't separate from the economic and social transformations. It was part of the same package. Settling down, cultivating crops, living with larger groups, all of these demanded new ways of thinking about time, about nature, about the forces that controlled human survival. And humans remarkably created those new ways of thinking, created gods who matched their new needs, created rituals that made sense in agricultural contexts, created beliefs about ancestors and fertility, and the land that reinforced their commitment to staying in one place. By 5000 BCE, by the end of the Forgotten Age, agricultural peoples across the world had developed rich spiritual traditions, different in details, but similar in fundamentals, all focused on fertility and harvest, all incorporating ancestor veneration or other ways of connecting past and future, all creating sacred spaces and times that structured community life. These beliefs would continue evolving. In a few thousand years, some would develop into the organized religions we recognize today. But the foundations were laid here, in these millennia of experimentation and adaptation. When humans learned to stay in one place, they didn't just change where they lived, they changed what they believed. And those beliefs, those spiritual systems created to make sense of agricultural life, they shaped human culture as profoundly as the crops themselves. So we've seen agriculture emerging independently across the world. We've watched spiritual beliefs transform to match this new way of life. We've traced the development of technologies that made settlement possible. The whole package looks like progress, like humanity ascending to something better. But there's another side to this story, one that's less comfortable, one that challenges our assumptions about progress and civilization, and whether the agricultural revolution was actually good for the humans who lived through it. Because here's the uncomfortable truth that skeletal remains don't let us ignore. The first farmers were less healthy than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. Measurably, significantly, undeniably less healthy. Let's look at what bones tell us. When archaeologists excavate agricultural sites from 7000 to 5000 BCE and compare skeletons to those from hunter-gatherer sites from earlier periods, the differences are stark. Height. Early farmers are shorter. On average, men lose about 2.5 to 4 inches. Women lose about 2 inches. This isn't genetic, it's nutritional. When children don't get adequate nutrition during their growth years, they don't reach their full genetic height potential. Shorter stature is a direct indicator of childhood malnutrition. Teeth. Hunter-gatherers generally have excellent dental health. Their varied diet of meat, fish, nuts, fruits, and vegetables doesn't promote tooth decay. But farmers eating soft, starchy diets of cultivated grains have terrible teeth. Cavities, abscesses, tooth loss at young ages. The constant exposure to processed grains creates ideal conditions for dental disease. Some agricultural skeletons show that individuals lost most of their teeth by their 30s or 40s. That's not just painful, it's life-threatening. Dental infections can spread, cause sepsis, kill you, and it's making eating difficult, compounding nutritional problems. Stress markers. Bones preserve evidence of stress during growth. Harris lines, horizontal lines visible in long bones, show periods when growth stopped temporarily. Enamel hypoplasias, horizontal grooves in tooth enamel, show the same thing. These indicate episodes of severe malnutrition or disease during childhood. Early agricultural. Populations show these markers far more frequently than hunter-gatherer populations. Their childhoods were harder, more periods of hunger, more illness, more times when their bodies struggled just to survive. Skeletal wear. The bones show evidence of hard physical labour. Arthritis appearing at younger ages. Joint wear from repetitive motions. Spinal stress from carrying heavy loads. Agricultural work is physically demanding in ways that leave permanent marks on the skeleton. Women's skeletons particularly show this. Knee joint degeneration from kneeling to grind grain for hours daily. Toe bone changes from squatting in grinding positions. Lower back stress from bending, lifting, carrying. The work of processing grain, day after day for years, it changes the skeleton itself. Life expectancy. This is harder to calculate precisely from skeletal remains, but the general pattern is clear. Life expectancy at birth may have dropped by several years in early agricultural populations, primarily because infant and child mortality increased. Disease. This is where things get really grim. Living in settled communities with domesticated animals created perfect conditions for disease to spread and evolve. When you're a hunter-gatherer band of 30 people, you can't sustain most infectious diseases. If someone gets sick, they either recover, die, or pass it to the few people around them who then also recover or die. The disease can't spread further because there aren't enough susceptible hosts. So most serious infectious diseases simply can't maintain themselves in small mobile populations. But in an agricultural village of 200 people, that's different. Diseases can spread, jump from person to person, persist in the population, and as villages grow and trade networks connect them, diseases can spread even further, moving from community to community. And then there are the animals, living in close proximity to sheep, goats, cattle, pigs. These animals carry diseases, and some of those diseases can jump to humans. We call them zoonotic diseases, and they're devastating. Measles probably came from cattle, smallpox possibly from a cattle-related pox virus, influenza from pigs and birds, tuberculosis from cattle. The great killers of human history, the diseases that would eventually kill millions, possibly billions of humans over the millennia, they emerged during the agricultural transition. Not all at once. Disease evolution takes time. But the conditions were being created. Dense human populations living with domesticated animals, perfect incubators for new pathogens. And early agricultural communities had no immunity to these diseases. No genetic resistance built up over generations. No medical knowledge about how diseases spread or how to prevent them. When epidemics swept through, they were catastrophic. Imagine you're living in a farming village around 6000 BCE. Someone gets sick. Fever, coughing, weakness. Within days, half the children in the village are sick. Within 2 weeks, a third of the village is dead. You don't know why. You don't know how to stop it. You perform rituals, make offerings to the gods, but people keep dying. This happened, repeatedly. The archaeological record shows mass graves from this period. Dozens of bodies buried at once, suggesting epidemic events, and the survivors have to continue on, traumatized, depleted, trying to plant and harvest with fewer hands. Nutritional diversity also declined. Hunter-gatherers eat incredibly varied diets. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies show they might consume several hundred different plant and animal species over the course of a year. This variety ensures they get all necessary nutrients. If one food source fails, dozens of others are available, but farmers become dependent on a few staple crops. In the Levant, it's wheat and barley. In China, rice or millet. In Mesoamerica, maize and beans. These crops provide calories, they keep you alive, but they're not nutritionally complete. Relying heavily on them means you're missing essential vitamins and minerals. Vitamin deficiencies show up in bones. Scurvy from lack of vitamin C, rickets from lack of vitamin D, anemia from iron deficiency. These conditions are rare in hunter-gatherer populations. They're common in early agricultural populations. And here's the cruelest irony. Farmers are producing more food than hunter-gatherers. They're creating surpluses, storing grain for lean times, but they're less well nourished. More food doesn't mean better food. It just means more carbohydrates. Work hours increase dramatically. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest they work about 3 to 5 hours a day finding food. The rest of the time is leisure, socializing, sleeping, playing, creating art, telling stories. But farmers work constantly. Clearing land is brutal labor. Ploughing, in regions where ploughs exist, is exhausting. Planting takes days or weeks. Weeding is never-ending during the growing season. Protecting crops from animals and birds requires constant vigilance. Harvesting is intense labor compressed into short time periods. Processing grain, grinding it daily for food, takes hours. Then there's maintaining tools, fixing houses, making pottery, weaving cloth, all the other tasks that agricultural life demands. Add in the increased time spent on childcare since agricultural families have more children, and you're working 10 to 12 hours a day. Every day. With no weekends, no vacations, no retirement. The myth of agricultural leisure, the idea that farming freed humans from the drudgery of hunting and gathering, it's backwards. Farming created drudgery. Hunter-gatherers had leisure. Farmers had endless work. Violence increased too. We talked about this earlier, but it's worth emphasizing. The skeletal evidence shows more traumatic injuries, more healed fractures from being struck, more cranial injuries, more embedded weapon points, more defensive. Fortifications at settlements. Why? Because farmers have something worth stealing: stored grain, livestock, land, and they can't easily move away from conflict. So disputes escalate into violence, raids between villages, warfare over territory and resources. Hunter-gatherer violence exists, certainly, but it's typically lower intensity, mostly one-on-one conflicts or small-scale feuds, systematic warfare, organized group violence that correlates strongly with agricultural settlement and resource accumulation. And environmental degradation is beginning. This early, the effects are localized. But around settlements, deforestation is happening. Trees cleared for fields and fuel, soil erosion starting on cleared land, water sources becoming polluted from concentrated human and animal waste. The land showing stress from intensive use. Some settlements are abandoned after a few centuries, not because of conquest or disaster, but because they've degraded their local environment to the point where it can't support them anymore. The soil is exhausted, the nearby forests are gone, game is scarce, so people move, establish new settlements, and begin the cycle again. This is the emerging pattern. Agriculture allows higher population density, but only temporarily in any given location. Eventually, you exhaust the land and have to move or intensify practices with irrigation, fertilization, crop rotation, technologies that won't be fully developed for millennia yet. So let me paint the full picture. You're a farmer around 6000 BCE. You're shorter than your hunter-gatherer ancestors. Your teeth hurt constantly. Your joints ache from repetitive labor. You're working 12-hour days in the fields. You're eating mostly grain, day after day, filling your belly but slowly developing nutritional deficiencies. You've already lost 2 children to diseases that swept through the village. Your village got raided last year by neighbors who stole grain stores, and 3 people were killed in the fighting. Your oldest daughter is pregnant at 15 because agricultural societies have girls marry young to maximize reproduction. You'll probably die in your early 40s if you're lucky enough to avoid disease, accident, or violence. Compare this to your hunter-gatherer ancestors. Taller, healthier teeth, varied diet, 3 to 5 hours of work per day, ample leisure time, strong social bonds in small groups, mobility to avoid conflict, lower disease burden, living potentially into their 60s or 70s if they survive childhood. By almost every individual measure of quality of life, farming made life worse. So why did people do it? Why did they keep farming once they realized how hard it was? Why didn't they just go back to hunting and gathering? Because they couldn't. This is the trap. The agricultural trap that locked humanity into this new way of life, even though it made individual lives harder and shorter and more painful. Agriculture allows higher population density. A territory that could support 40 hunter-gatherers might support 200 farmers. Not well, not healthily, but it can support them. Once your population grows to 200, you can't go back to hunting and gathering. There isn't enough wild game and wild plants in that territory to support 200 people. You'd starve. You're trapped. You need to keep farming because there are too many mouths to feed any other way. Even though each individual life is worse, even though you're working harder for less health and less happiness, you do it because the alternative is watching your children starve. This is why agriculture spread despite its costs, not because it made better lives, but because it made more lives. Agricultural populations grew faster than hunter-gatherer populations. More children survived to adulthood, despite the higher disease burden, because agricultural societies could support more children. And larger populations have competitive advantages. 200 farmers can defend territory better than 40 hunter-gatherers. They can clear more land, plant more fields, expand into new territories. They can sustain losses in warfare or epidemics and rebuild. Slowly, over thousands of years, agricultural populations grew and spread, not conquering always, though sometimes, more often just expanding into empty spaces, or intermarrying with hunter-gatherers, or simply out-reproducing them. By 5000 BCE, agricultural societies occupied much of the Near East, spreading into Europe and Central Asia. Agricultural China was expanding, Mesoamerican agriculture was established, African agriculture was spreading across the Sahel. The balance was tipping from a world primarily inhabited by hunter-gatherers to one increasingly dominated by farmers, but not everywhere. This is crucial. Some populations successfully resisted agriculture for thousands of years, not because they were unaware of it. They often lived right next to agricultural societies. They knew about farming. They chose not to adopt it. Australian Aboriginal peoples maintained hunting and gathering successfully for another 10,000 years. They had contact with agricultural peoples in New Guinea and Indonesia. They could have adopted agriculture. They deliberately didn't. Their sophisticated land management practices, their deep environmental knowledge, their carefully maintained trading networks provided everything they needed. Agriculture would have been a step down. Many indigenous peoples of the Americas coasts remained hunter-gatherers. Rich salmon runs, abundant shellfish, marine mammals. These resources supported dense, complex societies without agriculture. The northwest coast cultures of North America developed hereditary chiefs, monumental architecture, elaborate art, all without farming. Arctic peoples remained hunters and fishers because the environment made agriculture impossible. But they weren't primitive. They were incredibly sophisticated, with technologies and survival skills adapted perfectly to their environment. Even in Europe and Asia, some groups resisted agriculture for centuries or millennia after it reached their regions. Living in forests, mountains, or other environments where hunting and gathering remained viable. So agriculture wasn't inevitable, it wasn't universally adopted, and the people who resisted it often made very rational choices. They looked at agricultural life, saw the costs and said no thank you. But the populations that did adopt agriculture, they were growing, and that demographic advantage, that ability to support larger populations even at the cost of individual quality of life, that eventually tipped the balance. This is the paradox at the heart of the agricultural revolution. It was a terrible deal for individuals, but it was a brilliant deal for the species. It allowed human populations to grow from millions to eventually billions. It created the demographic base for everything that came after. Cities, kingdoms, civilizations, all of it rests on agriculture's ability to support large populations. But that came at a cost paid by every farmer grinding grain with aching hands, every child stunted by malnutrition, every woman dying in childbirth, every village devastated by epidemic disease, every worker labouring in fields from dawn to dusk. The Forgotten Age, these 7,000 years between 12,000 and 5,000 BCE, they transformed humanity. But the transformation wasn't a simple story of progress. It was a story of trade-offs, of sacrifices made, often unknowingly, by people just trying to survive and feed their families. By 5000 BCE, the foundations were laid. Agricultural societies were established on every inhabited continent except Australia. The crops were domesticated, the animals were tamed, the villages were built, the social structures were in place, the spiritual beliefs were formed. Everything was ready for the next transformation, the one that would lead to cities and writing and kingdoms, the one that would finally produce the civilizations we recognize from history books. But none of that would have been possible without these thousands of years of patient, painful experimentation. Without generations of farmers who worked harder and lived shorter lives than their ancestors. Without the slow accumulation of agricultural knowledge and technology and practice. The Forgotten Age built the world at great cost, and we're still living in the world it created. So here we are, back in the present. You're still sitting wherever you started this journey. In a house with walls and a roof, the descendant of those first permanent structures built 12,000 years ago. You probably ate today food that came from crops domesticated during the Forgotten Age. Wheat or rice or maize or potatoes, every single staple food humans eat today, every domesticated plant and animal, they all trace back to these 7,000 years of patient experimentation. The world you woke up in this morning, the entire foundation of modern life, it was built during an age that history forgot. While everyone talks about ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, about the first cities and the first writing, they skip over the thousands of years that made those things possible. But you know now. You've travelled through the Forgotten Age. You've stood on hillsides watching the ice melt. You've seen the first villages rise. You've watched humans learn, generation by generation, how to stay in one place, how to plant and wait, how to live with strangers, how to think about tomorrow instead of just today. Those people, your ancestors from 7,000 years ago, they had no idea what they were building. They weren't trying to invent civilization. They were just trying to eat, trying to take care of their families, making small adjustments, tiny experiments, learning from failures, slowly transforming both the plants and themselves. They paid a price for it, worked harder, lived shorter, sacrificed the freedom of movement for the security of stored grain. They didn't know their experiments would eventually lead to pyramids and temples, to writing and mathematics, to everything we call civilization. They were just grinding grain and tending fields and hoping the harvest would be good, but they built the world anyway. The forgotten age that nobody talks about, the 7,000 years between survival and civilization, the patient, quiet time when humans learned the most important lesson, how to stay. And now, having travelled through their world, having seen what they built and what it cost, maybe it's time to rest, to sleep, to let the story settle. If this journey meant something to you, maybe leave a like, drop a comment about where you're listening from. But mostly, just rest now. Dream of fields being planted for the first time, of seeds waiting in the earth, of ancestors learning to stay, of the forgotten age that built everything. Sleep well.